All right, it's time for us to start JavaScript. I hope you're really excited. JavaScript is way fun. I love when we start getting into the actual programming of this course, but JavaScript is a lot different than HTML, but I hope you find it exciting. Okay, since this is an introduction to JavaScript, we are not going to learn everything at one time. I'm giving you a broad overview of this, and then as we move into next semester, we'll start really getting down to the nitty-gritty. So don't feel bad if you leave this particular video and you don't understand everything I said. So before we get started with programming, I like to really put in my students' brains this 3 of 3. There are 3 things that have 3 things that I want you to know about. Okay, that's basically it. The 3 things, one of the 3 things, input, processing, and output model. There are 3 control structures and there are 3 data types. So let's start looking at the input, processing, output model. When we as a developer create a program, the user of our program will need to input something, whether that is a mouse click, whether that is loading our page, or whether that is typing something into a text box control on a form, or checking a box on a form, or clicking a button on a form. The user is inputting something in some way. Our program has to process that input. What is it doing with what the user put into our program? And then what is it going to display to the user afterwards? So what if the user inputs a number? Maybe we do math with that number, and then we show the results out to the user on the screen. Input, processing, output model is a good way for us to have this common language when we're talking about our programs and when we're debugging the programs. But all of your programs will have some kind of input, processing, and output. Now let's look at control structures. Control structures allow us to change the flow of our program. Microsoft Word has 200 million lines of code, 200 million lines of code. So the developers of that program, the coders of that program, use control structures to change the way that program flows. There are 3 main control structures in programming, and this is for all languages, not just JavaScript. We have sequential, a selection or decision structure. I use either of these words. It's not like one's better than the other. They basically mean the same thing. And a repetition or loop structure. They basically mean the same thing as well. So for a sequential structure, it's basically one line of your code executes, then the next line executes, then the next line executes, then the next line executes. This is primarily kind of what we've seen with our HTML, okay? But with a selection statement, we can say, hey, is something true or is something false? If a condition is true, then we'll execute some statements. But if that condition is not true, we may execute some other statements. And we'll talk more about this later, but selection statements are typically either an if statement, an if-else statement, or a switch statement. Now with repetition, got ahead of myself. With repetition, this code will repeat. If a condition is true, then some code executes. Then it checks the condition again, and if the condition is true, then the code executes, and then it checks the condition again, and if the condition is true, then the code executes, and it's just a repetitive process. It repeats itself, and we'll talk more about these loops in a future lecture. We also need to have an understanding of the 3 data types, the 3 main core data types that we'll use in JavaScript: numbers, strings, and Boolean data types. Numbers can be used in calculations. Duh, right? Duh. No, turns out there's a trick here. And a number can either be an integer, which is a whole number, or a float, which is a decimal number, okay? So basically you have 2 types of numbers, an int or a float. Now, I said that numbers can be used in calculations, duh, because strings can also be numbers. But strings cannot be used in calculations. A string can be any combination of letters, numbers, symbols, anything basically that you can enter on your keyboard can be a string. But strings are enclosed in double quotation marks or single quotation marks. And I said single or double, it just needs to make sure they match. Like you couldn't start with a single and end with a double. You couldn't start with a double and end with a single, but you can use either or. And I, for some reason, switch up between using single and double all the time in my coding. It makes a mess in Python. So if you can get used to using one or the other, it's better off. But strings cannot be used in calculations. And sometimes we'll even have to change or convert our strings from a string value to a number value just so that we can use them in calculations. And the last data type is a Boolean data type. And that is, it either has a value of true or false. That's it. A Boolean value can be true. A Boolean value can be false. And that's it. That's all. True or false. Okay, so our 3 of 3. We have 3 things that are really, really important for us to know right now. The input processing output model, which is, oh, that's easy. Input processing output. Haha. We have 3 control structures: sequential, selection, repetition, or sequential decision, loop, however you want to say it. And then we have 3 data types: numbers, strings, and Booleans. Okay, there's a quiz open in Canvas about this, so go take that quiz, and it's timed because I really want you to understand this. Okay, so make sure you have a really good understanding of that 3 of 3 before you go take that quiz. All right, good luck.